Hello, my name is Janice B. Gordon, and this is Scale Your Sales Podcast. Welcome to Scale Your Sales Podcast, listed number 9 of 43 best podcasts for every sales professional. I am Janice B. Gordon, the customer growth expert, awarded RevTech strategist of 2024. In today's episode of Scale Your Sales Podcast, my guest talks about lagging indicators. Lagging indicators, looking at the right activity that's going to enable your new onboarding sales senior leaders to demonstrate success quickly. And one of those is pipeline. Are they able to create pipeline, to generate pipeline? If they're able to focus on that, then they're going to be successful much quicker in their roles. So this is one indicator that you should be focusing on. The other aspect we were talking about, one of the biggest challenges actually knowing that you're hiring the right people, senior leaders and seasoned salespeople. There's a real coaching debt, and this is making assumption that past performance is an indicator of future performance, but often that's not the case. You're going to have to listen to the episode when we discuss more about that. My next guest is a self-prescribed sales nerd. Early on in her career as a BDR and then AE, she learned everything to become a quota crusher on the job through some raw talent and grit, and obsessively focused on process. When she moved into sales training position, after 5 years of sales, she realized that there's an art to the craft of sales, an art and a science. So since 2008, she has founded and run Toying with This Idea. Welcome to Scale Your Sales Podcast, Caroline Holt.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast, Caroline. I really want to get into this one with you about hiring seasoned salespeople. And I know that you've got lots to say on this, lots of experience. So I really want to just, hand it over to you. And what is your view? What is the biggest challenge here?
Oh, it is such a spicy topic, and probably some of my clients or past clients would know that I have a lot of thoughts here. I think the biggest thing with hiring seasoned salespeople is that most people are hiring with the expectation that these folks are going to come in all ready to go. They feel like they are buying that skill on the market, and so they often are willing to pay more for it. They tend to want those folks to come in, have very little onboarding, and then just be off to the races. But my experience would say that that's kind of a fool's errand, right? Every person, regardless of their background and experience, needs some fundamental pieces of what they get in that new experience in order to be successful.
Yeah. I love that the expectation of people is completely unrealistic. And the thing is, I've never met a sales leader that hasn't admitted to making a bad sales hire, but yet they still have the expectation that past performance is, an indicator of future performance. But you've just lifted that person out of environment where they've been successful for a whole host of reasons, put them in another environment, a different culture, sometimes even a different vertical, different clients, and expect that success to be exactly the same. What's your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. I think you've hit on a few of them, right? So you have no idea what that experience was before. And so part of what I see is a lot of seasoned salespeople in one environment. They've sold at a large SaaS company that is very heavily resourced. And then they are dropped into a smaller place where they're a bigger fish in a smaller pond. But they might not have sales engineers. They might not have BDRs who are doing the scheduling for them. They may not have, they might have had all these great people that they worked with in their past experience as prospects and customers, but those people may not be ready to just pick up and go and start working with them at another place, right? So they have a lot of pieces. I think that the primary one that I see, regardless of tenure or experience, I even see this in some smaller companies who do some internal promotion, is that having pipeline is actually the most critical part of somebody's ability to be successful. And so companies solve for it in different ways, right? Some you come in and your job is to just go out there and sell. But if you don't have an understanding of who your market is, if you don't have an understanding of who your ideal buyer is, if you don't have an understanding of who the influencers are in your sales process, how to speak to them differently, how to establish relationships with them, how to actually get time, FaceTime with them, it's a long ramp before you can actually do that. And so I think a lot of organizations focus on the lagging indicators. It's an enterprise sale, or it's going to take them 6 or 12 months to be successful. But in that time, they may or may not have been productive. And so, a lot of where I focus my energies is helping ensure that from the first day somebody gets on board, that they are actually being successful and productive in building pipeline. So I actually think that the leading indicator of learning how to self-schedule or self-source opportunities, understanding how to get in front of the right buyers, making sure that they have the right opportunities to start creating opportunity for themselves, is the best lagging indicator of performance.
And that's interesting, because isn't there a step prior to that in terms of, is that person coachable? Is that person comfortable accessing decision makers? Is that person comfortable having conversations around money? Are they able to sell value? There's some of the behaviors, rather than skill set and competence, some of the behaviors and limiting behaviors are the things that create the success in that salesperson. So if we're able, which we are, to identify what are those kind of intrinsic and behavioral competencies or traits that's going to enable that person to take all of that ramp up information, or to fill the pipeline, or to have the conversations that will fill the pipeline. Yeah. So identifying much of those intrinsic traits, first of all, that will enable their success.
I agree. You're now getting to the hiring piece as well, right? So we tend to also assume that, right, based on a resume or what somebody's been able to do in their background. And so I think what you're also hitting on, which is so critical, which is, what are the actual skills and outcomes we need from this role? And then do our hiring questions, right, the things that we're testing for in that hiring process, right? You can some of these are traits, and some of them are actually quite coachable, right? So you have to make sure that you have somebody who is willing to take feedback. And I love to test for that in the hiring process, right? So one of the things I'll do is make sure that we've got some sort of role play, and then somebody else in that role play is giving feedback, right? And then in a separate interview, I will have somebody else say, hey, so what was the feedback that Caroline gave you in that conversation? Did they hear the feedback? Do they know what to do with it? Would they, okay, so if you were to do that again, what would you do differently? Can they hear any of it? Or are they quite defensive around, well, she said this, but she doesn't really understand my industry, right? So it's a great way to test for that coachability. You can't obviously see as much of that until they're actually in seat. But if you hit on several key areas, right? So one is, are they comfortable with money? Are they, discussing money? So a lot of the challenger-esque traits on teaching and tailoring and taking control of the sales process, you can test for some of those things in the hiring process, but then there's also need to be leading indicators of performance and onboarding, right? So things like developing the pipeline, you're right. You might be able to develop a lot of pipeline, but if you can't advance those people through a sales process, or you can't ultimately get them comfortable and kind of navigating internal stakeholders with or without your direct support and influence, you can test for some of that during hiring. But I do think that those are all really critical skills that you teach during onboarding, and you inspect, right? So I would assume that somebody's got 10 years of experience can do these things, but I don't want to assume that, right? I want to make sure that somebody's able to test out of it, right? So if you in your second or third week are able to show me that you can actually do those things successfully without going through training and certification, additional certification on it, great, you're off to the races. But I think that if we assume that somebody can do that, we fall prey to something that I can't tell you who it was who said it, but I loved it in an interview. I was interviewing somebody on behalf of a client for a VP of sales role, and he talked about coaching debt. And I loved that term. And when I asked him about it, he said, it's really this assumption that because they've done well someplace else, that they will do well here. And I typically take on coaching debt in the way a technology company might have tech debt, right? Something that's a legacy that, maybe the same person that you're interviewing with right now has always struggled to build pipeline or has always struggled to have those difficult conversations. And so you have to assume that there's a level of coaching debt, right? And then you inspect what you expect. And so if you just trust that the person comes in, they're going to be successful, they know how to do all the things, and your job is just to manage them to a number, I think everybody comes out in a bad spot.
I think that's a great term, coaching debt. And I was literally just having this conversation, interviewing before about past performance, what not an indicator of future performance. And there are people that are not coachable, and you need to make sure that you do not hire those people. So there's a database that I have access to it and use that's able to coach, able to test for if they're coachable or not. And we always say to clients, if they're not, do not take them on. Yeah. Do not take them on. And that it's just historically, we've got so many sales managers pulling out their hair, trying to switch on this salesperson that doesn't have the drive and the grit. Again, it's not one of those traits that interviews normally pick up, because they're so good at selling themselves. You believe everything they say, so you need to test for it, because otherwise you've got a problem. Are they coachable? The other sales success is listening over talking. Well, we know salespeople are supposed to be very gregarious, and exactly as you've said, it's important to test for that. Did they hear that feedback? Did they take it on board? But these are sometimes things that sales leaders, talent managers miss, and it's so critical for sales. So I completely agree with you, which is why I use this platform that has done 2.6 million assessments, so we're able to identify those sales traits that are critical for success. So yeah, I could not agree more how important this is. You've got to start right, haven't you, Caroline?
You really do. Yeah. I mean, it actually, I think it all starts, most companies start in the wrong place. They start with, we've just hired this person, and then they create the plan, which is often honoring whatever this person did before. Oh, they've got a ton of industry experience, ton of sales experience. All they're going to need from you or whomever is this thing, right? Sales enablement is basically an entire profession built around bad hiring decisions and the need for sales managers to have some additional support. I say that in jest. Of course, there's a lot more to sales enablement than that. But I do think that a lot of how sales enablement got started is because there were skills and gaps that are missing, large sales goals, and sales managers often don't feel like they are well positioned to be able to do a lot of that coaching and development. But sales enablement is they typically not magicians, right? They can't create something out of nothing. And so really starting with, what do we absolutely need this person to be able to do that's critical from the first day they get here? And what are the things that are coachable that we can recognize that even very tenured salespeople are going to have at least 6 months to 12 months, in some cases, even 18 months of ramp, because that's how long it takes to create skills, to create pipeline, to be able to close large deals with multiple decision makers. So, depending on how that organization goes to market will dictate some of that. But making sure that you understand clearly, what are the specific activities that they need to be able to do as part of their job, and then build back from that to, okay, so what does that mean? What does success look like? And then build back from that to, okay, how are we going to measure that? And then how are we going to teach that? Right. And so what most people start with, and then how are we going to hire for it? Right. So you've got to take that blueprint to go a step back to say, okay, there are 5 key competency areas that we know are absolutely critical from day one. And then some others we can say are coachable. We'll work with that person over time. But that is what needs to go into HR's hands. That is what needs to go in the hands of the sales leaders or any of the people who are involved in the hiring process. And I find more often than not, people are over-indexing for culture, which often is that's where tools like yours come in, right? If your gut feeling, which is often driven by, oh, I see myself in this person, or I see that they could actually be here, has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not they're going to be successful, unless it becomes more of the self-fulfilling prophecy of, I'm just going to keep working with this person until they are successful because I saw that they had some skill here and I'm just going to keep kind of molding and developing them. So I think there's a lot of component parts that in most organizations are pretty siloed today, and we flip. We put I'm hiring the person first because I liked them, or they showed some of these raw talents in my interview process that resonated with me. Now figure out the training program, figure out the certification, or don't worry about certifying. Let's get them onto the road as quickly as we can. And then 12 to 18 months later, you have somebody who you're kind of scratching your head. Why are they still not performing? They had all the right characteristics that I thought would work well here.
I absolutely love this, what you say. I mean, there's so much to dig into, but, and I know you said it in jest, but there's an element of truth here in that sales enablement is having to be magicians and deal with the bad hiring practice. And we need to stop that, because then sales enablement can really do what it's there to do. It's to make people even better. So take that potential and make it reality. And I think the other thing that, in what you were saying is that it's an individual track. It's not kind of one size fits all, because if you're able to identify the intrinsic, whether people are motivated intrinsically or extrinsically, or if they have certain skill sets and certain limiting factors that are so critical to their success, it's going to change based on an individual, but you need to have an enablement process that allows that individual to really prosper. And there's so many different elements that have to feed in that in order for them to ramp up a lot quicker.
That's right. That's right. I have a question for you. Do you believe that people can ramp more quickly?
I think if you're hiring the right person, so if you've got someone that is guaranteed to succeed and you know the potential and you know really where the gaps are in that individual, if you have an onboarding, we fall down in sales on onboarding, isn't thorough enough. It's almost like 1 week and that's it.
It's orientation. We confuse
Yeah,
orientation
it's an orientation
and onboarding.
week. It's
Yeah.
an assault course of orientation. It's not really an enablement ramp up onboarding. And then the managers do not coach. There isn't a program for managers to coach the individual, not the deal, the individual over a period of time. And this is what I love about this data. But once you've got an assessment, and it's the only sales specific predictive and verified assessment that I use, once you've got that, it's almost like having a compass or a path, a blueprint on the individual. So you know where the gaps are, and you get the coaching notes. The manager gets the coaching notes of how to coach the individual to be the best they can possibly be. And so the managers get the guidelines, the whole operation is in sync because you're dealing with individuals rather than the whole team as one. So I believe, yes, to your question, you can ramp up a lot quicker when you have the insight around that individual and you're able to tailor your onboarding to the gaps and the support that individual needs to be the best they can be. It is absolutely possible to ramp up in probably half the time, really.
Love that. And I think you've hit on something that is so critical also for the enablement professionals who are listening to this, because there's rarely enough time from the sales management's perspective or the enablement team's perspective to have a custom onboarding experience. Unless it's one person coming on board, you're still roughly using what you usually use. And so you're either pushing them through it and requiring that they go through content that they may or may not need, or you're saying, I just don't have the bandwidth to do this because, I'm one to many. And so I'm just going to keep doing the thing that I have done. But what you're talking about in terms of really understanding the individual and understanding what they're coming in with and what they need in order to be successful, and then coaching to that is incredibly powerful.
Well, can you imagine? We know there's a lot of waste in sales. We know there's a lot. So you can imagine, well, I spoke at GTM conference and I was talking about I asked the audience to raise their hands. This is all, revenue leaders. Raise their hands if they could achieve the same revenue targets with half the team. And only 25% of them said yes. Well, my first question is, if it's yes, why aren't you doing that? And the other 75% is, I kind of evidence why that's going to be the case in less than 5 years from now. So this is why it's absolutely critical that you have the right people in the right seats. 77% of people, according to this database that's been going for the last 30 years, should not be in sales or in the wrong sales position for their natural skill set. So if you put the right people in the right positions, they're going to succeed anyway. Now, how are you going to ensure they're consistently succeeding? It's not a one-off, but it's consistent. So if you're going to have a smaller revenue team, that means you need to enable less people. That means you can spend more time enabling them on an individual point of view. But you can only do that if you have this roadmap, this insight into the individual. So you need to start with making sure you're hiring in the right person, but also making sure you have that insight on that person. Love
Absolutely.
this.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. This is why I said I can't wait to get into this with you, because we had all of this information, and I love this is like your hot topic.
I'm spicy. I'm spicy, Janice.
I know that, Caroline. So what would you say is the one thing organizations, because I know you work with a lot of organizations now, really helping them not only on their enablement, but their whole sales operation. What do you think is the one thing organizations need to do to make sure that they're future relevant, that they're customer centric with their revenue operation going forward, that would really excel them? What's the one thing that you think that would really make a difference that they need to focus on, Caroline?
It's a little challenging to say this because this is where the money comes from. But I think that so many sales organizations are so focused on the next thing they have to report to the board, the next quarter, the next performance, the next check-in, that they in many cases are not incentivized to think longer term. Now, that's not necessarily true, right? There's probably large payouts and other things that may be happening over several quarters. But I think so many of the challenges that I see within sales organizations are very fundamentally focused on, we can't afford to do that right now because we've got to, we're going to miss this cost target, or we're going to not do this. And so people continue to shrink their teams, shrink their budgets, shrink their sizes, and then expect that the performance is going to improve. I can't solve for the financial piece, but I do think that I don't hear and see as much focus on a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and how are we building for that, as opposed to what's happening this month, this quarter. And so I don't know that it's a silver bullet, so to speak, but I do think that the biggest challenge is, how are we going to make sure all this stuff that we're doing today is actually going to be effective a year from now, and not just the thing that we're reporting on right now and then on to the next thing. I think the other part is that because a lot of these things that you need to do to make change, implementing a new CRM, maybe you've had the same CRM for a number of years and you're implementing a new CRM. These things have so many component parts. Often it's the announcement and the initial sizzle, and then it's off to the next thing. And so I think that, I don't know whether it's necessarily a project management team, but I work with somebody who is so powerful in her ability to remind people of the component parts of what need to happen in order to get the outcome that they're looking for. And most people, particularly in a sales and revenue organization, are very focused on today, undoubtedly, because they have to be, right? That's what we're delivering on. That's what's at stake. But I think there needs to be somebody who is really focused on what's happening in a year or two from now, and making sure that that voice is not silenced because we're so focused on today.
I love this. I absolutely love this. This short-termism is, the bane of our industry. And I think aligned with what you've said is, I often ask not only revenue leaders, but CEOs, what is the impact of your decision on your customers? And it's really hard for them to answer that. you know, and I delve deeper. I keep kind of like pressing that button, because if you do not know the impact on your customer, how can you make that decision? How can you be making that decision? And I think that's an aligned with what you're saying, because we often make very short-term decisions, but actually the long-term impact on your customer is detrimental to the whole of the business, because we're not thinking that far ahead.
Absolutely. You know, the decision to scale back and have technology do more of the work, for example, around support or customer success. You might be able to load 200 customers then onto one person, but you can't tell me that that's not having a negative impact. If all of a sudden you've got, you know, somebody who used to be able to reach a human to address their challenge when they had it, and then work through that and move on to the next thing. Now they've got to send 4 or 5 texts. All of that stuff starts to be a cumulative pain, right? And that ultimately leads to customer failure, customers starting to disengage and going elsewhere. And so I think that customer centricity, you know, a lot of what I talk about in my work with, you know, when I was in-house and out of house, is buyer and customer centricity, because it doesn't really matter internally what we think about anything. It's all about the buyer and the customer. If the buyer is not interested and the seller is like, well, I think you should do this because this, or this, or I think they should buy because of this. Well, who the hell cares, right? It's the buyer who has to be the one who says, yes, I need this because, and I can articulate that internally to the people who matter. Similarly, on the customer side, if they, you know, if we are doing things that may provide short-term gains in terms of financial performance, that's great, but it doesn't, the cumulative effects of that for the customer may be eroding market share in a much more meaningful way than whatever that small cost savings was.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love this conversation. Right, if you were on a desert island on your own, Caroline, what would be the one thing you would take with you?
So I've heard some of your guests talk about this before. My brain went to a mirror, because not for vanity reasons, but because I am a very efficient person. I like to do things quickly and I like to do things efficiently. And a mirror would enable me to get fire by having the light reflect off, and then hopefully to be able to signal that I need some help and I need to get off the island, but then also to be able to keep me warm, help me cook, that sort of thing. But I think if I were thinking about it, like, here I am on the island, and what else am I going to do here? I'd probably want a really good book. I find that one of the things, I'm in school right now, full time. I'm an executive MBA student at the University of Virginia, incredible program. And I also am working full time and running my own business and have 3 children and all these other things. And so for the early part of my life, reading was something that was incredibly painful. I didn't read until I was 8. It was very difficult for me. And I came into reading later in life. And so I have found some of the most, you know, fiction to be just an incredible way to escape. So I think if I were on a desert island by myself, I would want something fictitious to lift me off and take me someplace else.
You know what, Caroline, if we could stop time, I would definitely put you on a desert island, because I think you need a bit of a break. And give you a really good book, and one of those endless books that just, the story never ends, you know, and just gives you all of the nurturing that you need, really. And then, you know, like, you can then jump off maybe a year later, but time hasn't moved from you. You're back into your life. You're well rested. You're completely nurtured. You've got a lot going on there, Caroline.
I know, but you know what, Janice, that would not be my style. I would be figuring out how to build a house on the island, and, you know, figuring out how to create the boat and replicate whatever Tom did in Castaway, you know, so.
Yeah, it looks like you'll end up with a whole village on that island by the time you've finished your year.
I might.
That book may not have gotten read at all.
It probably would have gotten read very quickly, and then I'd be off to doing something else.
To other things. Well, you know, thank you so much for sharing your insights and knowledge. Really enjoyed this conversation, Caroline. Thank you so much for being a guest on Scale Your Sales podcast.
I loved it. Thank you so much for inviting me, Janice. It's so great to spend time with you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Scale Your Sales podcast. If you like this discussion, feel free to listen to other episodes or watch the captioned show on YouTube. and subscribe to future episodes. I would really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you.